You're never going to hear me say that the online environment fundamentally reshaped our notions of privacy. I think I can best explain my own notion of privacy by critiquing other notions of privacy. So for me, what I particularly like to do in my own research is distance myself from very liberal notions on privacy that are neglectful towards broader social, economic, or political processes. So for me, privacy, it's not an individual property or something that needs to be ensured completely by the individual or can be completely ensured by the individual. So what I try to do on a micro level and on a macro level is study different types of privacy. But I treat it on an interpersonal or social level, I treat it as a negotiation process, a boundary coordination process. So I don't know if you know this theory, but it's the communication privacy management theory of Sandra Petronio. It sees privacy also as a negotiation process that is highly dependent on other people. So we might have the feeling that we own private information, but it's governed collectively together with other people. So it's dependent on the context and on others. So that's on the more social or interpersonal level. But when you look at a societal level, I very much think of privacy as a fundamental right in line with the UN Declaration of Human Rights. So I think this is especially challenging nowadays because privacy in today's data economy is often seen as a property that can be traded for other services and other goods. But I try to, on a macro level, see privacy as a fundamental right. I think it's directly involved with democracy, but also with developing your personal identity as well. Well, basically what we need, we have the need to establish personal autonomy. We need privacy for that. We also have the need to share very private information with a secluded group of other people or only one person to establish trusted relationships, to have intimacy. So on a very individual level, privacy is important, but also for guaranteeing your democracy. It can only function when you have privacy. You're never going to hear me say that the online environment fundamentally reshaped our notions of privacy. I don't believe that. But what I do believe is that there are different actors, different ways in how your information is being used, and that distinction between offline and online can be useful and grasping that. To a certain level, it's appropriate to make a distinction, but I think we would be kidding ourselves if we would see them as completely separated environments, because of course what happens in the online environment has an influence on the offline environment and vice versa. But I also think on different levels privacy is being challenged. So first of all, what I think and maybe most obvious is that the social affordances of social media are, well, challenging our notions of privacy. In this context, I think everything is more or less delineated, you could say. I have the role of being interviewed, you are my interviewer. I know what's going to happen with this data and so on. But in the context of social media, it's more or less difficult. We have emerging between public and private sphere. We have invisible audiences, context collapse, which also makes it difficult and what kind of information can be shared and how it will be processed and used. So that's one thing I think that challenges our privacy. Another thing, and I think this is also pretty obvious, is that different technologies, and this is not just social media, but also recommender systems, wearables, they all make use of personal information and often in ways that we would not agree with or in unforeseen ways. And I'm thinking about Cambridge Analytica, of course, but I'm also thinking about Facebook using our telephone for advertising purposes and not only for guaranteeing our security. So for me, again, this shows the disempowerment of end users and the surveillance or data veins that we are confronted with. Recently, Mark Zuckerberg also wrote a piece on how the internet should function, and he was also very much in favor of a regulation framework like the one that we have in Europe, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. But he does not really question his own business model. He does not really question the way that he constructs the notion of privacy as something that needs to be controlled by an individual. And I think that's very problematic. We shouldn't give such a stage to Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg or other big CEOs. We should make sure that they respect and protect our privacy, and that's it. Then again, we can also ask questions about the media literacy of the senators. Some people didn't even know that Facebook was gaining money through selling ads or personalized ads, which I think is truly problematic. So worst case scenario for me is still letting third parties and very commercial companies dictate the rules. But at the same time, I also think that worst case scenario is having a blind belief in technology solving social issues. Well, it reminds me of a book that is written by Virginia Eubanks. She's an American researcher, and she also looked into public services being more and more automated. And there was one part in the book that really got me, and it was housing projects, so social housing projects for people in Los Angeles that were also more and more automated. And when interviewing homeless people, she noticed that they were faced with a difficult trade-off. If they would want to make the priority list, they had to disclose a lot of information, but at the same time, it also opened them up for law enforcement scrutiny. So basically what we see is that coordinated entry system, it's not just for managing information or matching demand and supply, it's also very much a surveillance system, and that categorizes people, poor people for that matter. So I think when we look in Flanders or Belgium, of course, the situation is not that dramatic, but I do believe that we have a kind of a discourse that focuses very much on technology and sort of a neoliberal belief in technology. So very technological, deterministic, utopian view that social issues can be solved with a technology alone. And I try to distantiate myself from that. I do believe that personalization and data collection can help to a certain extent, but technology can never replace other stuff that we need to solve social issues. So what I think that we need to do is that we need to be very reflexive and question that discourse and have a reflective attitude anytime a new technology is developed that tries to solve a social issue. I don't believe that the blockchain will solve everything, every privacy problem that we have. I don't believe that privacy by design, which we often hear nowadays, will also solve everything. I think it's important to include the voice of users when developing new technologies, but when a technology gets adopted and appropriated in society, new problems will arise. So you cannot really solve every privacy problem through something technological. And when we look at everyday discourse, they try to steer in that direction. Like when you hear Mark Zuckerberg talk about privacy, he often is going to say notions about transparency and control. We're going to give the end users more control options. But it will never be completely possible for end users to see the full or the bigger picture, which also makes it difficult to value privacy on a societal level. Of course, you can experience certain breaches, like people are disclosing information that you do not want, or some people that are confronted with identity theft, but the linkage to equality, to freedom, to democracy, it requires a sociological imagination, I guess, that moves beyond that personal experience to really grasp. But then again, what we see in research is that people actually care about privacy. It's often difficult to see the entire process and what happens with your data. And often when certain leakages became transparent in the press, for example, then people cry with an outrage, but also their disempowerment is very obvious. Then what can I really do? So managing your information towards third parties like Google, Facebook, or other social media, it's very difficult as an individual. When you look at the terms of services of Facebook, it's longer and longer and longer. And well, basically, we do not really have the time to read all of that and to control all of that. And I think in line with my conceptualization of privacy as a fundamental right, this is something that needs to be ensured for the individual. It's very difficult as an individual to stand up towards big companies and question their policy. Of course, you can to a certain level, but it's very difficult because in our everyday life we're also busy with developing social relationships or social capital or self-presentation. So to again and again take into account all that data collecting and processing, it's very difficult as an individual. Of course, and I think most people know this, is that a lot of personal information is being used, your profile information, but also behavioral information and so on. But what we see the last couple of years is an expansion both on a horizontal and a vertical level. So more data is gathered from different sources and deeper and more detailed information is also gathered. To give a very concrete example, the social plugins that you see on other websites, and you can press the like button. Initially it was just there to say I appreciate this content, for example, but also that information through buttons and plugins is also used for various reasons. I recently read another article, and that was about the relationship between social games and between service providers like Facebook. And in 2011, 12% of the total profit of Facebook was made by Zynga. So basically Zynga, it's a gaming company / data collecting processing company, and they were in 2011 very big for games like Farmville and Mafia Wars. But this is something that we often forget, is that it's not just the big companies like Facebook, but also other third parties like social games and social media that help Facebook and other companies to collect and process data. So these are different ways in how data is being collected and used. And these are often things that we're not fully familiar with as an end user. But I have to say, what I really dislike, and in literature there's a very popular concept about this, is the privacy paradox. It says that people tend to care about privacy, but they also share a lot of personal information. And there are researchers that see this relationship as very paradoxical. I don't necessarily see it that way. When I look at my own research, when I see people who are highly concerned about their privacy, is that they will also score higher on their privacy management. So having stricter privacy regulations, or also negotiating more with others on what can and cannot be disclosed. So that paradoxical relationship I do not really find in my own research. Also, when we're asking very sensitive information, when we're asking about very sensitive information, for example, sexually explicit photos, we see that on a personal level, people will have more strict privacy settings, but they will also negotiate that content more with the people with whom they disclose that information. So for me, this is not something paradoxical. This is normal behavior. To say something more about the privacy management, what I also think that we need to say is that users tend to move beyond the privacy settings that are offered by service providers. And there's a very nice article by Dana Boyd and Alice Morrock in 2011. And they interviewed a teenager, and she made use of the social steganography strategy. Basically, what the social steganography strategy, what it means is that people tend to disclose, or that particular teen was disclosing information, very sensitive information, and everyone has access to that information, but there were only a few people who actually understood what the meaning of the message was. Like, for example, a certain YouTube video or a quote of a certain song. People will not always know what that's about or to whom it's directed and so on. So you can be very private in public. Certainly when we look at the online environment, an increased reflexivity is needed, an increased set of skills. But at the same time, protection is needed for that reflexivity to not become excessive. So what I would like to argue is that the right to control privacy is important, but the right to privacy is equally important as well.